Welcome to GRN, the Growth and Resilience Network, where every episode brings you targeted stories and strategies for your professional and personal growth and resilience. I'm Steve Piscitelli, your host, coming to you from my world headquarters in Atlantic Beach, Florida. And this episode's topic is work-life balance. In our 24/7 everything is an immediate response micro-message world, we have lots of demands on our time and attention, and even more distractions. So finding time to maintain a healthy balance between work and our personal lives can be difficult. And when we include the demands and joys of parenthood for our working parents, we add in more layers, more challenges to do a great job in one's career, provide quality parenting, and care for oneself. And we're talking about millions of families and millions of working parents. Consider these findings from the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics. In 2014, there were a little over 34 million USA families with children. About 90% of those had at least one employed parent. And nearly two-thirds of the married couple families with children had both parents working. That adds up to a lot of parents and kids touched by our topic today. And then I found something with the Pew Research Center. Here's a quote. The number of fathers who are at home with their children for any reason has nearly doubled since 1989, when 1.1 million were in this category. And it reached its highest point, a little over 2 million, in 2010. That's why our subtitle today is A Working Dad's Perspective. Every working dad out there could have a different take or perspective. So whoever is the working parent, one thing seems constant. He, she, they have a great deal to juggle, and a lot's at stake for mom, dad, child, marriage. Now, back in September of 2015, I recorded a podcast conversation with Miss Katie Mahan looking at a working mom's perspective, and I got a few comments saying that I should not disregard the man's perspective. And that's why today our guest is a working dad. This is Mr. Bryan Crawford. I asked him to describe himself. Now, I've known Bryan since college, and he said he's just the guy trying to do his best for his family and friends. He's rather self-effacing. He's more than that, but that says a lot about Bryan. He's a person who loves to get healthcare startups with meaningful advances to improve the quality of lives off the ground to commercialization. He's a very energetic, very positive man. He loves music. He's a guitar player. He tickles the ivories. And he says he's a fan of old-fashioned baseball. In fact, I'm going to use a term that he'll probably be upset with. He was a star baseball player in college at our alma mater, Jacksonville University. He's shaking his head over here. He is the father of 3 grown children, ages 32, 28, and 24, and he has been blissfully married to his bride, Eileen, for 37 years. So let's welcome our working parent in resident today to the GRN studio, Mr. Bryan Crawford. Welcome, Bryan.
Thank you, Steve. It's good to be here.
It's been better to have you here. All right, let's start. We got a list of questions to go through today, and we'll see where the conversation takes us. All right, first thing we have to do is clarify what you and I are talking about when speaking of working fathers. As I mentioned with the Pew Research Center, there are more and more stay-at-home dads these days. So I'm looking at this very traditionally as a dad with employment outside the home. Are you seeing it the same way, or do you have another perspective?
I think that working dads is really evolved to working parents. I mean, whether you're a mom or dad, it's a terminology term that has evolved over the years. You know, back in 30 years ago, working dads were a small number compared to what the number is today. So I think that, working dads is kind of becoming more obsolete, you're a working parent.
Working
and
parent.
I don't think they're as segregated as they used to be.
That's interesting, because one of the questions I had, and I'll just jump down to that, because I said, is this a different topic than a working mom's perspective, or should I have just done one podcast and called it a working parent's perspective? And I'm hearing that from you. You don't. The gender doesn't make a difference. That you're seeing the same challenges for the working parent, regardless.
I believe it is, yeah, especially in two working parents' homes, because you're splitting up the duties and responsibilities and caring for the kids and whatnot. So
interesting. You mentioned the duties. So you and Eileen, some 32, 33 years ago, you're moving into parenthood. Did you sit down and create job descriptions, for want of a better category title? Like, this is what you'll be doing, Eileen, this is what I'll be doing, or did you just make it up along the way?
It was classic on-the-job training. And you have a good question there. Did we write job descriptions? No, but did we talk and communicate? Yes, thoroughly and all the time. And we had to call audibles all the time.
Ever the athlete.
You have to be flexible, you have to be adaptable, and you have to be able to, make decisions on the fly. So, but as long as you're working together, it works.
And as you were doing that back then, you're working already. I mean, so you knew that was going to be a dynamic. Was that a big piece of the conversation, the working part, or was it really where we're going to put the diapers and who's going to do the cooking? I mean, was it more, I hate to say mundane, but more household? Or were you talking about the job and the travel and all that, which we're going to get into?
Sure. It's really a combination. You have to talk about the what you call mundane, which some people would call thrilling, to
right.
Wash diapers and all that kind of stuff. But no, it's
that might be a podcast.
Yeah, it might be a podcast. But we very, I think, successfully were able to talk things through and have a rationale behind each decision. Whether her job called her in early in the morning or mine kept me late at night or whatever, we'd have to in advance planning. And planning was really, really critical. But again, with the opportunity which happens more often than not, that you had to be flexible. So I think it's just an integration of the things that have to be done.
When I look at and I think about the years I've known you now, I guess 40 or so years, you're a mellow person. I know you have your times. Everybody does. You mentioned flexibility and you calling the audibles, and you had 3 kids, and they were close in age for the most part, I guess. Yeah, they were close in age. Is there a DNA in this? I mean, are there some people that I look back, my wife and I never had kids, and I look back and we were saying this off microphone, I don't know if I could have done it. What makes you so, I mean, did you learn this? Or is this Bryan? This is how you are. You're calm.
Well, I think everyone has their own demeanor, and it starts in early childhood, and you grow up, and your demeanor evolves. But basically, your foundation stays the same, and there just might be different elevations of the demeanor. I was fortunate. I grew up in a family of 7 kids. So talking about flexibility, I was the middle child. So you have to be flexible. In that case. So I think that contributed a lot to, us raising the 3 children.
7 kids.
7 kids.
7 kids.
Yes.
All right, so let's look at that. Your dad was a working dad,
yes,
working parent. Yes. And so we're going back now, nearly 60 years ago with that. And you mentioned like 30 years ago things might have been a little different, but there still was some dynamics that are similar. Looking back at what your dad did or did not do, did that inform you moving forward? Was that a part of what you and Eileen were talking about?
Yeah, for sure. He had a major influence, and he still does to this day, about raising kids. He was a person who, growing up and with 6 kids, he worked. Sometimes he worked 3 jobs to get the food and the clothes. I mean, we never were not starving.
Right.
He worked really hard.
Your needs were taken care of.
The needs were taken care of, and Mom working real hard at home, managing 7 kids and nurturing and all these kids and soccer and the whole thing. It was great. It was a great environment to grow up in and to watch my dad as a role model.
Can you remember back to one thing he did as a dad that when you look at it, and I know there were probably many things, is there anything that pops out and you say, like, wow, I think back and I still remember how he did X?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one thing that pops out is I do love baseball, and I grew up as a kid playing baseball. Even in the winter, I would throw snowballs, and those were the baseballs. But my dad, even working 2 and 3 jobs, I remember one game he told me he couldn't make it, and I was pitching, and I just glanced over, and he was there, and he had popped in between jobs to come see me and to come see me play. And I was only there for a few innings, but that meant so much to me. Do
you remember how old you were?
Yeah, I was 14.
Wow. So you're going back 45 years or so, and that's there.
Yeah. And what he did to get there, I found out later. I mean, what he went through to come to that game? Couple of innings, yeah. It was pretty amazing. It struck with me, yeah.
Now, part of your job with helping startups, you do an immense amount of travel.
I live on a plane and I reside in Florida.
And folks, that's true. That is true. And you've been doing that ever since your kids have been, since they were born. It's not 2 or 3 jobs, but still, for a young person, a young couple listening to this, and they're thinking about having a child, or they've got one, and one of the two is going to be on the plane tomorrow, Monday, whenever. Suggestions? I mean, how did you balance that? And you still balance, you're still traveling, but the kids aren't in the house. How did you balance that?
So, you talk about work-life balance, and it's really amazing because it can be very complicated, scheduling and all that stuff and the logistical aspects of it, but it comes down to priorities. And this is where I go back to my dad. I mean, he made it a priority. Whatever he did to get to that game, he made it. So what I took from that, and as Eileen and I started raising kids, is that family is always first in our household, and whatever I could do to make a play or a soccer game or basketball, and I coached, you just have to make it a priority. And as far as balancing, it's called the affective person, AFFECT. What you have on other people. So if you're going off balance, not only do you have an effect on your own being, but you can tell the effect on the kids, on your spouse, whether that balance is going a little awry. And so I think if you're cognizant of that, you'll be able to work things out. Now, it's not always easy. You do miss some things. But if you have first and foremost in your mind the priority of your kids and your wife or your spouse, it seems to work out.
And this idea of you miss things at times. In the research, and I came across this when I was preparing for an earlier podcast with the working mom's perspective, and there was this thing called mommy guilt. Is there such thing as daddy guilt?
Absolutely. No question about it.
No question.
No question about it.
How did you work through that?
Well, you just... it's very difficult, especially when you have to look your child in the eye and say, I'm not going to be able to make it, or I'm sorry I missed it, and talking with them. But when you talk things through and you try to just not have an excuse, but explain the situation, whatever it may be, whether it's an important meeting or whatever the case may be, you just try to talk it through. And then your spouse is incredibly helpful because they're the ones who pick up the pieces, if you will, when you're gone.
When you're gone. Yeah.
And they dry the tears and that kind of thing. So again, communication, I can't overemphasize enough the amount of communication it takes to make it work.
And that's not only, it sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, not only with your spouse, but with your children.
With your children, absolutely.
And when, did you have to explain to them, now Daddy is going to go fly, or did they? Was it just as common as them picking up their books to go to school? It's Daddy's going to the office, and it happens to be in California today and tomorrow. Was there that discussion with them, or?
Well, we would bring out the map and say where Daddy's going, and so there was a geography lesson involved. So we try to make it fun.
Cool.
Yeah, we try to make it fun when they were little and things like that. So whatever we could do to be innovative and to be creative and try to create an environment where they could understand better what the situation was.
Yeah.
And then they also, I think, in the benefit of this is they form trust. Because you're honest with them up front, they know what to expect, as opposed to disappointing them afterwards. If you didn't make it, something that you told them to do.
Yeah.
So being upfront with them and treating them like little adults, even as little kids.
And early on, I mean, there were times I would assume that maybe you traveled all week. You left on a Monday, came back on a Thursday or Friday. So now you're home. And travel, for those who haven't done it, and think it's glamorous and glorious. I can tell you, and I do a fraction of what Bryan does, it's not fun. It's not glamorous. It takes a toll. I mean, it's not like putting a roof on a house in the middle of the summer in Florida, but it takes a toll. So now you're home. You're a bit exhausted. What did you do to go about creating a distraction-free, work-free zone so that when you were home, you weren't traveling daddy getting ready to travel again in 2 days, but you were at home daddy? Did you have or was that an on-the-job training? How'd you do that?
So back in the day, if you will, before cell phones and iPads and all this kind of stuff, when you left the office, you left the office.
Good point.
And you didn't come home to, a computer. Mm-hmm. We didn't have them. And it was refreshing because the kids, they would, wrap their arms around you. Dad, let's go play, have catch, whatever the case, kickball, whatever the case may be out in the yard. And it was automatic.
That's an interesting point.
It was automatic. And if I stayed at the office late, I was getting there. But once I left, I left. So it was refreshing to come home and have the smiles on the kids' faces and playing. And then decompressing is sometimes when you have things on your mind, as you all know, coming home from work. What I found is that when it was time to mow the lawn, that was my decompression time because it's such a mindless task.
Yeah.
And then you play with the kids, and that's your reward. So I looked at it as a reward coming home and having the kids to be with and to play.
And was most of your time then, as they were growing up, in our pre-internet time?
Oh, I was absolutely pre-internet time.
Yeah.
Yes, thank goodness.
That would be tougher today.
I can't even imagine what it's like because of the boundaries that have to be created. I would imagine have to be created. But our kids were all pre-internet. Yeah. So I don't envy the parents out there. And I watch and I observe friends and the younger generation struggling with the balancing of the technology, which could be really important and useful and resourceful with the whole, boundaries.
Yeah, and you make I love the concept of boundaries and limits. And back in the day, as you say, they were almost set for us.
Right.
You left the office. Not now. All right, let's go another direction. What the audience may not know is that your wife is visually impaired. She's never been able to drive. And that placed the transportation duties on you. School, doctors, groceries, shopping, squarely on your brawny shoulders. How did you do that? You were the driver. You were the transporter, and you're flying. How did you end up juggling all of that? Because it's not like, okay, dear, let's split up the task today. You go to that side of town, I'll go to that side of town. You get her to the recital, and I'll go to the baseball. No, you're doing it all. Talk to us.
Sure. I mean, it comes down to planning and communicating and being prospective or proactive, I should say, and communication. And it's really and I'm not trying to make light of this because I appreciate what you're saying, but it's it's kind of like two working parents, because like Eileen was working in Philadelphia and she would take the train, and she would take an early train, and then everything was on me. Whether she was visually impaired or not, that was the situation. So then I would take the kids to daycare, go to work, pick them up from daycare, get them all set, that kind of thing, which I cherished because I had more time with the kids than. So I looked at it as a very opportunistic, not opportunistic, but an opportunity to actually have more time with the kids. But planning, to answer your question, it's just planning on steroids.
Yeah,
that's how you do it. That's how you do it.
So, and you're a good planner. You're disciplined.
I believe so.
Yeah, especially with your kids, obviously. Yeah. And what did you do for yourself? I mean, I know you said, hey, I could mow the lawn and decompress. Okay, but was there other than that? Was there a daddy timeout? Were you a runner? Did you still play baseball? I know you do something, I think, with your brother-in-law once or twice a year. You get together for a big fundraiser. Right. Talk a little bit about your timeout.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it a daddy timeout because you're always a dad, and love being a dad. Bryan timeout, sure. A couple times a year we go away for a golf weekend or a baseball weekend or something like that with the guys. That kind of thing.
And that helped with the resilience, the growth.
Sure,
kept you sharp.
Yeah. And I played softball, the teams, and leagues and things like that. And again, coaching.
Right.
Coaching was a real nice with the girls and with Evan. Our son. So
you coached all of their teams?
All the teams, yeah. All three
kids.
And
you still were getting on a plane?
And still getting on a plane, yeah. Had a great assistant coach.
Delegation, that's good.
Exactly.
Communication.
Exactly.
What do you think your kids would say if I asked them how you did?
I think they would look back with fond memories and say it was fun growing up in our house, and that they had a good time. They learned a lot, and that how did Dad do? I think they say he did okay, and I would take that as a really high compliment.
Well, I'm going to tell you something. I reached out to them.
Oh.
And I asked them a few questions about Dad. And listeners, he did not know I was doing this. He's like biting his fingers right now. Uh-oh. Final exam grades are coming in. All three of his children have extremely busy lives. They're extremely successful people. And so I did what I could to see if I could contact them. And Evan said, I remember as a kid that when Dad was traveling, we knew there would be a call, if not more than one, coming in the evening before we went to bed. In the evening before we went to bed. I think that as a kid, more so than when I got older, the mystique of travel was very real. So one way he kept connected to us was constantly keeping us in the know of where he was going, and when we would hear from him again. And that's exactly what you said about the geography lesson. And that made such an impression on him. Now, Evan is 32 now, and he can remember that. Yeah. And he said, this probably seems like a minor thing, and my guess is that it is something that just seemed as an obvious thing for him to do, which I really think that's part of your personality. And that's what I was saying before. You got that DNA that's so good for this job as a parent. But I think that, going back to Evan's words, I think that when you are a kid, the more concrete an idea you have about where a parent is, as opposed to the abstract, he's traveling, the less they seem like they are not home. That's pretty powerful stuff. And I think that's going to be powerful for your children if they have children. Right. The lesson, like your dad. Bryn, she said, again, these were independent emails I got, okay? He called home every night he was out of town. They remembered that. And I remember talking to him every night to say, I love you and good night. He was always very, very good about checking in. He was so involved in our lives, even when he was far away. And she continued and said, Dad would always do whatever he possibly could to be there for us in our big events. I cannot think of one dance recital he missed in 11 years of ballet. Again, that's what you remember, the baseball game. That's powerful. And then if you know Bryan, you never hear anything ugly come from Bryan. And she had mentioned that one of the things she admired was his outlook on life. And she finished with a smiley face and said, I like to think I get my optimism from him. And then you had mentioned also the environment you created in your home. I mean, there was this trusting, loving, fun-filled environment. And I was there many times, and it was just full of energy, good energy. And she mentioned that also about how you were surrogate parents sometimes to a lot of their friends. You had that house that was open, the hangout. Was that something that you and Eileen talked about, that this will be kind of like our gang's hangout here? Or did that just evolve?
It just evolved. That was never planned.
It wasn't a plan.
No.
Yeah, and again, that made such an impact. And the last thing, I'm going to go back to Evan. When I had asked about this distraction, were you distracted when you were home? Was he in the office working? And I got to love my godson. You know, he is so good. Here's what I really remember, Evan said. When Dad was home, he was home. I think this was what made him successful at life/work balance. Even during periods of time when he was traveling a lot, he made sure that when he was home, we were the priority. And then he went further, and I thought this was an interesting piece. I think what's really important is that being home does not even have to mean always doing something organized all together as a family, which I'm departing now from Evan's words. I think sometimes people think, okay, I'm home, so I've got to organize this, and we got to do this, and I got to be... And he continued, and this is what I thought was really cool. It was the absence of our perception that he was working while at home, and thus perhaps unapproachable. I think that observation did not take hold with me until I was teaching and had lots of conversations with students and sometimes mothers who would mention that the father, while not having a job requiring any kind of travel and was physically present, was still not present in the way that really mattered. So he says the absence of our perception. So it's another point. He said he might have been working, but we didn't see it. Maybe when we went to bed. So that's pretty cool stuff.
That's very cool.
That's really cool. Is there something about the topic, the working dad perspective, the working parent perspective, growth, resilience, that you want to make sure you say before we hit the end button?
I did write a note. I wanted to make sure that I covered with you. You had mentioned earlier about leaving the office, and when you're home, you're home. Again, back in the day, we didn't have the cell phone and the computer to come home to and things like that. Right. Now, but technology, if used wisely, could be a major advantage because you can leave the office earlier to go because you may be able to work after the kids are in bed, on the computer and things like that, with the emails catching up and things like that. So I think, and what I see as a disadvantage of too much technology is when I see so many parents, they do leave work home early, work the office early, take their kids to soccer, and then they're on the sidelines constantly on their cell phone and email, and their son or daughter scored a goal and they didn't see it. And the son or daughter looked over and they see that their parent didn't see it. So I think there's just again, it goes back to the balance, right? There's really good, appropriate use of technology, and it could be a tremendous resource if used wisely. So I just wanted to make that point. We didn't have that luxury back then.
Right. Yeah, you didn't. So I'm thinking of your father again, that great example you gave that not everybody has this opportunity with their job, but if you had the opportunity, you could slip away to go to the baseball game at 3:30 in the afternoon, and with the technology might allow you to do it. It's being creative.
Right.
It's planning ahead on steroids.
Right.
All right, a couple of...
Sure.
Well, let me do this before we get to those fun questions. What would you leave that was specific about technology and distractions at home. What would you leave the folks with today?
What would I leave the folks with today? Communication is so key. with your spouse and with your children.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, I don't think you can over communicate. Some people get into hovering and being helicopter parents and, things like that. But I'm not talking about that kind of thing. I'm talking about just being honest and upfront and just communicating. Planning, being organized is key. But at the end of the day, when you have all these decisions to make, whether they're career decisions or, especially the bigger decisions in life, is to follow your heart. Because if you follow your heart, you can't do wrong. You will not do wrong. And that's something that someone told me many, many, many years ago, and I followed that advice.
And I'm hearing again what you said earlier about priorities.
Yes.
Yeah, and the priority of communication, the priority of trust, the priority of planning. I mean, these are the things you just don't do it by the seat of your pants. Although sometimes with 3 kids,
right,
there was a lot of seat of the pants planning, I'm sure. But you were even planning for that. Yeah. All right. Before we go, a little lightning round.
Okay.
First thing that comes to your mind.
Okay.
If you were a box of cereal, what would you be?
Cheerios.
Why?
I love Cheerios every day. Cheerios and blueberries.
If you were a weather forecast, what would it say?
Sunny, 73, not a cloud in the sky.
Uh-huh. All right, folks. Thanks, Crawl. Bryan Crawford, he's known to his friends as Crawl. But Bryan, thanks for being with us. This has been wonderful. And truly, I mean, as a friend, I've watched Bryan raise his kids, and I'm just in awe at what he's been able to do. He and his wife, Eileen, and he's got 3 wonderful children. And thank you, listeners. Without you, there's no Growth and Resilience Network. Visit my website, stevepiscitelli.com, for more information about upcoming conversations and other GRN programs and resources that might help you or someone you know with personal growth and resilience. And you can sign up for my email list, and I'll promise never to spam you. So until we meet again, either virtually or somewhere in person around this great nation, this is Steve Piscitelli from my world headquarters here in Atlantic Beach, Florida, reminding all of us to choose well, live well, and be well. Bye-bye, folks.